Tonight I'll be talking about times when astronauts have snuck or sneaked. Both words are correct English. Although on Monday I accidentally used the word snucken, which is not a word. So I'm not talking about any of these space smugglers from a variety of TV shows and movies that some people might recognize. I'll be talking about actual astronauts. So some background first is astronauts for the Gemini missions, Apollo, Space Shuttle, ISS, and well, I didn't find anything about like Orion. I assume they do something similar with Orion now and SpaceX. The astronauts have a pouch. NASA calls it a personal preference kit. It's a fireproof pouch, and they're allowed to bring personal items. Has to be pre-authorized, though. They don't want somebody accidentally bringing something that in space will cause problems. So there's a review process. They submit stuff around 2 weeks in advance, so there's time to vet things and put this in the pouch. So these are things astronauts are allowed to bring on board. I'll be talking about things that astronauts have taken on board without going through the approval process. So we'll start with corned beef. Back on the Gemini 3 flight, an astronaut decided, oh, I'm going to take a corned beef sandwich, not let anyone know I have it. He stuck it in his pocket. This photo shows astronaut John Young. I have no idea whether the corned beef is already in that photo or if this photo was staged days or weeks before the actual flight. But then mid-flight, he pulled the sandwich out, offered it to his fellow crew member, Gus Grissom, who quickly realized that in microgravity, crumbs from biting into a sandwich, we're going to get in our faces, we're going to inhale these things. So he quickly stuck it in his own pocket. He didn't have a chance to eat the sandwich. I think he took one bite, but the sandwich was out for, I think, under a minute. This was the earliest incident I was able to find. I'm sure things happened earlier, but this one is one that's documented. So then Gemini 6, a couple of years later, was the first musical performance in space. Gemini carried 2 astronauts on each flight. So Wally Schirra, and in my research, I found 2 pronunciations for his name, like newscasters. Some say Schirra, others say more like Skira. So I wasn't able to find any recording of him saying his own name, but the name, I looked up his family's history, and it's an Italian name, but his descendants lived in Austria for a while. So probably the family probably started off pronouncing it with an Italian pronunciation, and then in Austria they may have gone over to a more German pronunciation. So as far as I know, it's Schirra is how his name. That seems the most common pronunciation of his name. So again, these were snuck on board, no prior authorization. And then let's see if this video plays okay. This was the only recording I found.
Got it.
Roger, Houston and Gemini 7,
It's not playing here.
Gemini 6. We have an object, looks like a satellite, going from north to south, probably in a polar orbit. He's in a very low trajectory.
I'll
traveling
email
from north to south.
link.
Has a very high fineness ratio. Looks like it might even be a bonus thing. Very low. Looks like maybe going to the energy soon. Stand by one. Looks like he's trying to signal something.
It's not muted.
No, we get feedback.
See,
We got him
we'll-
too, 6. That was live, 7, not tape.
You're too much, 6.
The key.
Yeah, so now this harmonica and bells, those were donated to the Smithsonian. I don't know what, they're probably in the Air and Space Museum, but they could be in some other museum that has musical instruments in it. Okay. So those first two were like honest, practical jokes. Now we start getting into corruption. It's a little more interesting. For Apollo 15, for all of the Apollo missions, the astronauts were equipped with watches from the company Omega. That's who NASA selected. I don't know what their selection process was. And you can see when during spacewalks, the astronauts they have a very visible watch on the outside of their spacesuits. Again, those had to be tested, and they made sure that the watches would work in vacuum. Well, a retired general who worked for a competing watch company, well, he wanted his watches to be on the moon. So through contacts, friends at NASA, he gave a watch to one of the astronauts who brought that. Dave Scott brought his official watch along, but he also brought this second watch. And then in the middle of the mission, somehow his Omega watch fell apart. Did it break or was it broken? There's not much information on this. He claimed that his supervisor knew that he was bringing along this other watch. And in 2015, the watch was sold at auction for over $1.5 million.
Was he the seller?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Right.
I don't know. Actually,
And no
I-
other Omega watches ever broke on a mission in space.
I think he had already died before 2015.
Oh, okay.
And actually, there's a slide later on where I can indirectly figure out the answer to that.
Oh, okay.
So here's a photo, and he's wearing the watch that's on his wrist here. Because it's,
It was outside.
Yeah.
It was outside.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
I thought it was
Yeah.
inside. It actually worked.
yeah,
It worked.
an analog watch will, like, if it's constructed right, should be able to work without gravity.
No, but you got a 500-degree temperature swing
Yeah.
between, light and dawn. That's got affected, really.
Well, that's probably what, John, that's probably why NASA went through a selection process and selected a standard watch for all of the Apollo missions.
Probably whacked the Omega on the stairway.
Yeah. Okay, so then I'll jump back a few missions to Apollo 11. Just here, nothing was brought on board the spaceship. It's just some background. For Apollo 11, which was going to be the first moon landing, the three astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, well, they couldn't afford life insurance. They could theoretically get life insurance, but it was so prohibitively expensive because of their high-risk careers that they couldn't afford insurance. Government policies somehow prevented NASA from providing them with insurance.
Yeah.
It's well,
Military.
right, yeah,
Plus they weren't paying them much.
right. And some insurance companies did like offer them policies, but they would have had to then do commercials. And Neil Armstrong was dead set against that. He didn't want to commercialize space. So what they did before Apollo 11 took off, they autographed a bunch of envelopes, left them with their families, pretty much saying, hey, if something goes wrong and we die, our signatures will become more valuable. Sell us to pay the mortgage and pay for college funds.
So John, I assume those were first day covers?
These were signed before they
Right.
flew.
What's the postmark date?
They're postmarked prior to the flight. Yes. Yeah. These were done prior to the flight.
Because they look like a first day cover, if you're familiar with those.
No, I'm not a
Those are
stamp
like
collector.
DE philatelists.
Yeah. So, and fortunately, they made it back alive, but some of those envelopes ended up getting sold anyway. So then Apollo 15, this was the incident that I learned about around 3 months ago that inspired this whole talk. So for Apollo 15, which happened to be the same mission with the watch and suspect handling of items on the mission. Well, here, a German stamp dealer and a friend of his who used to be a NASA contractor and the three astronauts on board cut a deal where the astronauts took $7,000 payment each, which in today's dollars is around $60,000 to carry envelopes to the moon. And the intent was they would postmark the envelopes on the moon and they would be sold later. There were some envelopes that were officially brought on board. The Postal Service and NASA and Smithsonian Postal Museum had laid out a plan for, oh, let's bring a couple of envelopes, let's stamp them on the moon, just for to advertise the Postal Service. That was going to be a few envelopes. On this flight, around 600 envelopes ended up on this flight because the stamp dealer arranged for the astronaut, his payment was for them to bring 100 envelopes. They each brought 100 of their own envelopes. They realized, oh, if this guy's going to be able to sell the envelopes, we can sell more of them on our own. So they each brought 100 envelopes on board.
Oh.
They didn't quite think this through. What happened when they got back home, a couple of months later, I don't think it was the German stamp dealer. It was Horst Eiermann, and I'm probably pronouncing his name incorrectly. The the former NASA contractor, who was sort of acting as a middleman here, he sold a couple of them. One of the potential buyers contacted NASA to make sure it was authentic.
Oh,
A
wow.
potential buyer thought he was getting maybe ripped off. So he asked NASA, oh, could you authenticate this envelope? NASA said, what envelope? How do you have an envelope? The only envelopes are now on display in the museum. So NASA investigated, there were congressional hearings. When the astronauts were first questioned by NASA management, they may not have been completely candid. So some managers backed up the astronauts, say, oh, our astronauts would never do this. So it got messy. This top envelope, this was one of the official envelopes brought to the moon for in conjunction with the Postal Service. So this top envelope was one of the official ones brought. This bottom photo, this stamp pad isn't the actual stamp pad. The museum display today, because the stamp pad was left on the moon. It was left to avoid having to lift that weight back into orbit. They left it in the lower module. And one of the reasons why NASA is so concerned about this stuff is it's not just for fire reasons, it's weight. They carefully account for weight. Well, imagine if Apollo 15 ended up with not enough fuel because instead of bringing 500, and I'm relatively sure that the astronauts probably did calculations to make sure they weren't bringing too much weight on, but this was frowned on. This shows this envelope, and you see the thumbprint here. That's because it was stamped on the moon out during a moonwalk. This was one of the unofficial, unsanctioned envelopes that ended up causing the scandal.
And that could not have been stamped on the moon, right?
Correct.
It's like, wait, we're busy.
Yeah. They wouldn't have had enough time on the moon to stamp 600 envelopes like, and Mission Control would have noticed. What are you doing? You had 2 envelopes. He's like,
Oh.
Trying to stop me.
yeah. So they signed this when they had downtime while they were on the moon.
So it's Al Warden, John who?
Jim Irwin
Jim Irwin.
and Dave Scott.
Dave Scott.
Al Warden stayed in orbit in the command module. The Apollo missions, for those who may not know this, the capsule carried 3 astronauts to the moon, but then only 2 astronauts went down to the surface in the lander. The third stayed in the command module in orbit. In part because even if the lander had the fuel to bring 3 astronauts down to the surface, computer control wasn't reliable enough back then to trust to leave their return ride empty in orbit around the moon, because if something went wrong and it went off course, well, then the 3 astronauts on the surface had no way of getting home.
How did they get, can you back that up?
yeah.
So those aren't addressed to anybody. How did they get the Kennedy Space Center stamp? You know, it's not like they could mail it
They
It was stamped beforehand.
at the Kennedy Space Center.
They were on the moon on the 30th.
yeah, This says July 26th, and this is stamped with USS Okinawa. This was the carrier that recovered
Oh.
them. There are post offices on board large Navy ships. So the,
With an August date.
yep, yes. So this was stamped before they left. This was stamped on return. So after the NASA investigations and the congressional hearings, all three were scheduled to be the backup crew for Apollo 17. But NASA pulled them from Apollo 17 as the backup crew and would never let them fly in space again. NASA couldn't send them back to the Air Force because the Air Force pretty much said, what they did, we don't want them back. So what happened afterwards, James Irwin, he was already planning to retire shortly after Apollo 15. So he retired, and then he started up a company searching for Noah's Ark. That was his post-NASA career. Dave Scott stayed with NASA, became the director. He had a couple of jobs. His final job was as director of the Dryden Flight Research Center, and then moved on to private sector aerospace work. So like NASA didn't fire them because they were well trained, they were smart. So NASA found other places for them to work, but they felt this was such a breach of protocol, they would never let them in a spacecraft again. And Al Worden became a chief at Ames Research Center and also moved on to do private sector aerospace work after. And then one of the changes is new policies were created that pretty much says you absolutely, it was sort of already against NASA rules, but now it became sort of federal law that you can't bring, and coins and stamps were expressly forbidden. The last sentence is items such as philatelic materials, stamps, and coins that by their nature lend themselves to exploitation by the recipients or create problems with respect to good taste. So there are certain joke items that no, astronauts would not be allowed to carry on board the spacecraft, even if it wouldn't be very funny. And of course, heavy items are forbidden. I'll give everyone a moment to read this. And in the first paragraph, there's mention of official flight kit. I described the personal preference kit earlier. The official flight kit, that's not something that an astronaut's taking on board. That's something like a package that NASA puts on board. Like the authorized envelopes between NASA and the Postal Service, those were in an official flight kit. In 1983, though, the Apollo 15 crew, they were partially vindicated. Al Worden sued. I'm not sure whether he sued NASA or the federal or some other branch of the federal government, but he and his lawyers claimed that the government seized their personal property, the envelopes, without conducting a proper hearing. There were congressional hearings that were just like focused on the overall thing, but the astronauts themselves really never had a chance to defend themselves. So as a result, the envelopes were returned to the astronauts. And this quote from Al Worden is, I think, very good. He said, "We probably didn't do the smartest thing in the world, but we didn't do anything that was illegal. We didn't do anything that anybody else hadn't done. On a lot of earlier flights, astronauts brought unofficial things on board. And while the general policy was, no, you can't sell things to make money, deals were happening under the table. They were like small, not like sponsorships, but people would bring things on board in exchange for financial gain. And that's why that later policy got created that makes that illegal. But at the time, it wasn't illegal. So he says, we didn't do anything that anybody else hadn't done, but the consequences were rather severe to us, because with Apollo 15, it became public knowledge. Earlier, only people within NASA knew that this was going on. And management, I guess, had more important things to do and really didn't like, it's harmless, let's ignore it. But with Apollo 15, because it became known to Congress, and this was before my time. I was 5 years old when this, 5 years, yeah, or around 5 years old when all this happened.
What year was this?
It was 73, correct? Well, no, well, they landed on the moon in 71, but I want to see if, no, I don't have a date for the hearings. I think the hearings happened in like 72 and 73.
This is interesting. It must have been, even though there were hearings, they were probably not very highly publicized.
No.
Not this part of it about the astronauts.
Apparently this was like a scan, this was in newspapers. Considering what else was going on in the country at the time, maybe it didn't make the front page. When did Nixon resign? Also before my time. But was that around the same time? So yeah. So maybe this was only on like the 5th page of the newspaper. And then I found this photo. It's completely unconnected to Apollo 15, but this is a photo of Al Worden in what appears to be a barren hotel room with a bunch of camping equipment. I have no idea. I couldn't find an explanation for this photo. But it's such a weird photo. This was apparently this was something Al Worden put on his Facebook page.
Is that a bear king?
Yeah.
And he's holding a lantern like a
Yeah.
signalman's railroad
Yeah.
lantern.
Well,
That's wild.
He's camping in a hotel room.
Right.
There's no context for it though.
Or maybe it's his house and he hasn't moved in yet.
Those windows though look like hotel windows, don't they? It looks like a. Yeah.
Think it would be birds. Looks like he's moving
Right.
ahead. It doesn't
Yeah.
have
Okay. Yeah.
furniture.
Maybe.
Thinking that it's probably from the
Yep.
60s then.
Yeah. But yeah, it's. And he's wearing a suit.
Right.
Okay, so now moving on to some lighter stuff. The ISS, for bringing things to the International Space Station, the rules are much more relaxed for a variety of reasons. Going to the moon is a lot trickier than going to low orbit. So going to the moon, every ounce matters. For low orbit, it's still important, but much less important. Also, we have cargo flights to the ISS. So, and I'll show some of these things. Things that are too big to bring on board a crewed capsule, they can send on one of the cargo flights to the ISS. And also, on the ISS, for the Apollo missions, the astronauts were so busy and it was relatively short term The ISS, people spent a year on the ISS. Well, just sanity becomes a concern. So they're allowed to bring toys on board the ISS. Musical instruments. There have been a lot of musical instruments brought on the ISS. There have been music videos filmed on the ISS. Chris Hadley, the Canadian astronaut in the upper left, he did
David Bowie.
yeah, make
Out of control of Major Tom.
yeah. A space oddity.
Straight up. Good.
Ah,
A gorilla suit. This was obviously sent up on a cargo flight. This was when the twin brothers, Mark Kelly and Scott Kelly, who were both astronauts, once spent a year. Was it Mark or Scott who spent the year on the ISS? Scott. Well, on his birthday, his brother arranged for NASA to send up a gorilla suit.
yeah.
Yeah, that weighs a couple of pounds, but on a cargo flight, it wasn't such a big deal. And there's video of other astronauts putting this on and chasing each other around the ISS.
500 pounds?
A Lego ISS
Oh, wow.
that was assembled on board. And because in zero G, you have to stop all these pieces floating around. He assembled it in a sealed container. Remember wearing a Star Trek uniform?
Yeah.
Drinking coffee out of a really weird looking cup. And this, there's a machine on board the ISS called an espresso machine, ISS presso, to make coffee. And someone figured out by using these weird shaped cups, the coffee, the water content tends to stick and like form drops. So the liquid tends to stick together rather than float up out of the opening. But capillary action in this shape always brings some of the coffee up to the very, very edge.
Yeah.
So as you sip the coffee, it sort of siphons even in zero G.
Oh,
So these are the standard coffee cups they use on board the space station. I'm not sure who had figured this design out, but yes, yeah, but the astronauts much prefer this to freeze-dried, vacuum-packed bags of coffee or juice boxes of coffee. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here. My voice is already starting to go, and here's a collection of AI generated photos of my talk. I typed like mail truck in space, sandwich in space, watch on the moon. And it's rather interesting what AI did with this.